Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is being presented by the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, also known as ESTEP. ESTEP is a collaboration of the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Electricity, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. The topic for today's webinar is the State of the U.S. Energy Storage Industry 2019 Year in Review. We have with us today our host for the webinar, Todd Olinsky-Paul. He's a project director at CESA, and our guest speaker for this webinar, Dan Foley, head of energy storage at Wood Mackenzie Power Renewables. And we also have with us Dr. Imre Zsuk from the U.S. Department of Energy. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. For the audio portion of today's webinar, we usually say that you can call in using your telephone or your computer mic and speakers. For this webinar, we would recommend that you use your computer mic and speakers for the webinar if you can. If not, telephone should be fine. For this webinar, we do have some pre-recorded remarks that we're going to be splicing into the webinar. You might hear it best through your computer mic and speakers, so we would recommend using that option if you can. Throughout the webinar, you can open and close or expand and collapse your webinar console by clicking on the orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also submit questions throughout the webinar, questions and comments, which we highly recommend that you do that by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We are recording this webinar, and we will send you a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides today or tomorrow. You'll get that email with those webinar materials. We'll also post them on our website at cesa.org/webinars. So that's it for our housekeeping. One more reminder before I pass it over. If you do have the option to use computer mic and speakers for your audio, that may be preferable. But if you do have to use your telephone, that's fine. The video that we will be playing, the audio might go through your computer speakers, even if you do dial in using a telephone, just so that you know to expect that. So now I would like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he will be starting us off. Todd?
Thank you, Samantha, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I believe this is our first ESTEP webinar of the new year, and I'm very happy to welcome Dan Finn-Foley back to do this. We've done this look back at energy storage over the previous year now for several years in a row, and it's always been a very popular webinar. So let me do a little brief background on CESA and ESTEP, and then we'll go ahead right into the presentations. I'm Todd Olinsky-Paul. I'm here at Clean Energy States Alliance in Vermont, and we work with state clean energy agencies around the country. You can see many of the logos of our members on the screen, basically helping them to advance their clean energy policy programs and regulation and so forth. This particular webinar is part of the ESTEP webinar series, and Samantha, if you could advance the slide, please. I'll give a little background on ESTEP. Basically, ESTEP is the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, which we conduct under contract with Sandia National Laboratories. It's funded by US DOE Office of Electricity. And through ESTEP, we work to bring state and municipal agencies together with Sandia and DOE to develop jointly supported energy storage projects. And these are typically large-scale projects. You can see some of the efforts that we've been involved with on the map there. It's all over the country. And so in addition to developing projects, we do a number of other things as well, including webinars such as this one, but we also work with states to help them with energy storage policy, regulatory, program development. And other things like writing energy storage roadmaps and so forth. So we're very engaged with states. Next slide, please. In this particular webinar, what we're going to be doing is our annual look back at the prior year in terms of the progress of energy storage by looking at the industry, looking at diverse applications that seem to be getting attention, looking at state policy developments and so forth. We are joined today by Dr. Imre Juk from DOE Office of Electricity. He's the director of the energy storage research effort there. He funds, in addition to our program through Sandia, a wide variety of technology deployment and R&D. And this is including advanced batteries, flywheels, supercapacitors, and compressed air energy storage. He has taught physics, civil engineering, and architecture at the University of Wisconsin and at Kuwait University. He holds a BS from Fordham University, completed his graduate work at Brown University, where he was a research assistant to Nobel laureate Leon Cooper, and obtained his PhD in theoretical physics from Purdue University. Dr. Juk, as Samantha mentioned, has pre-recorded his remarks as he was unable to physically be present with us today for the webinar. And as Samantha mentioned, we really do urge you, if you have a choice, to join us by computer rather than by telephone, because the audio portion of his remarks may not be audible to you if you're calling in by phone, but should work okay through your computer speakers. We are also joined by Dan Finn-Foley. He is the head of energy storage at Wood Mackenzie Power Renewables, where he focuses on front-of-the-meter energy storage applications. Dan previously worked as a senior consultant with DNV GL, where he focused on competitive energy markets and emerging energy business strategies. He's also worked with Navigant Consulting and the Department of Energy. So I think that's it for my introductory remarks. Reminder to please type in your questions as you think of them. If you're having trouble with hearing the audio, do let me know by typing in a comment in the question box, and that will help us kind of keep track of what's going on, and hopefully everything goes well and everybody is able to hear. I'll pass this over now to our remarks from Dr. Juk.
Hello, I am Imre Juk, and I direct the energy storage program at the Office of Electricity. Among many other things, we also sponsor the ESTEP webinar series, of which this webinar is a part. I would like to share with you 3 recent projects that we were involved in. The first one actually dates back to 2016, and it is a project in the small town of Stirling, Massachusetts. And they had received a grant for making their police station resilient. We worked together with them and our analytics program at Sandia, and we showed them that, in fact, they could make money on this project and get a return of some 6.5 years on the project. So it took 3 months for completion of the project. This is with NEC. And 2 years later, this is the result. As suggested by the Sandia analytics team, arbitrage, monthly peaks, and annual peaks were substantial. And you can see the numbers for the first year of operation. These are avoided costs. And for the entire period since then, you can see the cumulative costs, the cumulative savings here on this graph. These are always the monthly peaks, then the yearly peak, the monthly peaks, and the yearly peaks. As you can see, this project is really paying off. And by April of 2019, Stirling was able to log $1 million in avoided costs. They had also in the process become somewhat famous, and delegations from Germany, Switzerland, Denmark, etc., had visited the small town to see how a good project should be conducted. Now, the next project takes us up to Cordova, Alaska. It's a small fishing town, and they are supplied largely by run-of-the-river hydro. Now, run-of-the-river hydro is somewhat difficult to control, and so besides the 7 megawatts or so of hydro, they installed 2 megawatts of diesel. And on the average, this means half a megawatt is being deflected as spinning reserve. Now, I have to keep in mind that hydro is about 6 cents per kilowatt, and the diesel is 60 cents. Obviously, you don't want to go with diesel as far as you can. Our solution was to suggest an energy storage device. And here it is, produced by Saft, 1 megawatt, 1 hour, and the ribbon cutting, and it was commissioned in on June 7th of 2019. And this provides frequency regulation, load following, emergency supply. But so far, only anecdotal evidence. We are in the process of compiling more systematic data. But during the Thanksgiving holiday of November 2019, for 2 days, the utility was able to get away with 4 hours of diesel versus an expected 48 hours of diesel. And that adds up to $10,000 in savings. Finally, a project in Nantucket by the National Grid. The installation here is by Tesla, and the analytics was done by P&L. The situation Nantucket has 2 underwater cables that furnish the island. However, peaks, particularly during tourist season, were becoming larger and larger, and it became apparent that a 3rd underwater cable would be necessary. Well, an underwater cable is extremely expensive, and so the suggestion was to use storage to cover the peaks. The analysis by P&L showed that storage would provide $110 million in deferral value and $36 million in operational benefits. And this by installing 6 megawatt, 8 hours of storage, together with a 6 to 10 megawatt generator. Grand ribbon cutting again, and P&L had evaluated the technical and financial benefits. The ribbon cutting was in October 8th of 2019 with a return on investment of 1.55. In conclusion, good technology combined with good analytics makes for viable business cases.
Thank you very much. That was our presentation from Dr. Juk of DOE. We're now moving to the main presentation for the webinar from Dan Finn-Foley at Wood Mackenzie. And again, sorry to those of you who had some problems hearing or seeing that initial introductory portion, but that should be that problem should be solved now. And we'll move right along. Dan, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Todd. That's a great way to start things off. It's fascinating to see these pilot programs, innovative projects that are getting onto the system and really having a notable effect. One of the things you'll hear from me a lot is, of course, scale. This market is going to emerge rapidly into significant scale, and it's these pilot programs that are giving utilities and other investors confidence to make that happen. So yeah, really exciting to see those pilot programs. Thanks again. Once again, really thrilled to be here. My name is Danton Foley. I'm the head of energy storage for Wood Mackenzie Power and Renewables. Wood Mackenzie, for those who may not be familiar, is a global energy, electricity, subsurface, everything under the sun research and consulting firm. Our locations are there. I'm part of the sort of power and renewables energy transition practice. Within that lives the Happy Energy Storage team, focusing on energy storage trends, forecasts, prices, technology, pretty much everything worldwide with a focus on our energy storage subscription. I'll be walking you through some of the research that we've been doing, looking at our sort of what's been happening in 2019, the main trends that we see. If you're interested in subscribing to the energy storage service writ large to get all of the details, analyst access, event access, etc., please do feel free to reach out to me. Happy to discuss it in more detail. So with that, let's sort of dive into what's really been happening in 2019 in energy storage. And to tell this story, I like to sort of start with deployment trends, because I feel like this graphic really tells the story of the energy storage market super effectively. This is sort of a 2019 year in review conversation, but we're right now in the process of finalizing our Q4 numbers. So I won't be able to show you any Q4 numbers. They should be pretty significant, which is exciting, but those will be finalized in March. If you're an ESA subscriber, you'll have access to a discounted rate for the Energy Storage Monitor, and of course, it's included in the subscription as well. For those who may not be too familiar with the storage market, a very brief overview. The stationary energy storage market really emerged at scale in 2014-2015 in the PJM frequency regulation market. This was a market that introduced a new signal design for energy storage and was incredibly lucrative. A lot of energy storage, about 300 megawatts, really dove in to take advantage of that market opportunity. In parallel, some behind-the-meter, especially C&I applications, were being promoted, especially in California with the self-generation incentive program. The frequency regulation market saturated in 2015, not a whole lot of new deployments there, and we started seeing more scattered pilot programs, speculative deployments in the market. The next big phase came in the end of 2016 into 2017 in the Aliso Canyon natural gas leak. This was the first real opportunity for longer duration, in this case 4-hour energy storage, to prove its worth. About 100 megawatts of systems, I think about 104 were installed over the span of just a couple of months from inception to commissioning in order to supplement potential capacity that would be offline due to the Aliso Canyon natural gas leak. These systems were brought online on time, incredibly quickly, and they started providing grid services capacity to the grid. And really was the first time the energy storage truly cut its teeth outside of that ancillary services market in a big way. So this was a big moment for the market. That's where you see that big spike in Q4 2016, 2017. And then since then, the market has started to scale up. This is still a very new market. Lots of volatility. 1 or 2 large projects here or there can skew your quarterly numbers very easily. But we're starting to see things move more towards consistency and scale over time. The non-residential market has continued, primarily driven by California. The residential market has really caught on over the past couple of years, and we anticipate that continuing in the future with changes to the ESTEP program in California, encouraging resiliency for wildfires for C&I, potentially people investing in solar plus storage in that market as well. And from there, we really anticipate seeing things scale up. But you can see here very clearly that there's movement. You have those two spikes, the PJM market, the Aliso Canyon market, but now we're entering sort of more of a signal rather than noise moment for the energy storage market. You can see that if you look at the megawatt hour market as well. This is obviously taking into account the duration of the systems. The PJM boom doesn't look as big because those are shorter duration systems. Aliso Canyon, a big spike. And this really lets you see the scale up of the deployment. This is really how many batteries are actually on the grid. The actual capacity multiplied by the hour, the total energy capacity of these systems. And we anticipate this scaling up as well. Over time, we are seeing a significant movement towards longer duration systems, although there is still, of course, a market for ancillary services, shorter duration systems, but that market is relatively capped. Most frequency regulation markets are on the order of maybe 2 or 3% of total load. The real opportunity is going to be these longer duration systems moving forward. So looking at technology and system price trends, price declines are really what drove the market to develop at scale. The PJM market really wouldn't have been possible without significant declines in the lithium-ion battery space. If you follow the market, you'll know that the energy storage industry, stationary storage industry, is very much piggybacking off of the technology developments in the electric vehicle space. For that reason, because you have so much scale in EV, consumer electronics, building out massive amounts of batteries, those same batteries applied to stationary storage applications are, of course, able to leverage the economies of scale, the innovation in a larger industry. Because other technologies like the ones listed here, flow batteries, sodium, zinc flow, flywheels, don't really have a secondary industry to sort of piggyback off of, or don't have quite the characteristics that lithium-ion has, makes them difficult to compete. And we foresee that continuing over the next 5 years. Lithium-ion accounted for about 95% or more of the market pretty much for the past 5 years. There will continue to be pilot programs with other technologies, but it really won't be until maybe 2025, 2030 before we start seeing any sort of alternative technology emerge to challenge lithium-ion. This is mostly because there really isn't that much of a need for longer duration systems. Lithium-ion is competitive for 4 hours very well. Other technologies say they begin to compete at 8 hours, but as we saw, that Nantucket system, that 8-hour system, is of course a lithium-ion system. So lithium-ion is still outcompeting even at the longer duration of systems that we have. We anticipate that continuing, and a big portion of that is that, of course, lithium-ion prices are continuing to decline. There's further innovation, changes in terms of the types of chemistry that's involved, changes in manufacturing, economies of scale. For front-of-the-meter systems, we see price declines by more than 15% by 2021 compared to 2019 values. That'll hold true for the front-of-the-meter systems as well. The C&I and residential space are not quite as mature, so there isn't as much certainty. There isn't as much of a narrow range in terms of prices for the energy storage systems that are being installed, but we are seeing movement on that as well. As those two markets mature, we anticipate seeing a bit of a convergence towards the median that we see in the front-of-the-meter side. Again, these are not industry best prices. These are sort of median prices that we're reporting here, and then a range of sort of what you can expect getting into the market depending on various durations. The price declines are sort of entering a steady phase at this point. We anticipate maybe 5 or 6% declines across the various applications, front of the meter, behind the meter, longer duration, shorter duration, over the next 5 years, compared to some of the really significant growth that we saw back in 2014, 2015. So diving in next, I wanted to talk a little bit about chemistries, because this is a really important question. Lithium-ion is not a hulking monolith of a single technology. There are a lot of different variations that you have in the actual chemistry that you make with lithium-ion. And one of the big contenders right now is LFP batteries. There was a big shakeup in the supply chain in 2018. Incentives in the South Korean market drew a lot of supply to that market and sort of sucked all the oxygen out of the market for the US and Europe and some other regions in Asia as well. The Chinese LFP, lithium iron phosphate battery manufacturers, sort of stepped into that role. Lithium iron phosphate is a lithium ion chemistry, so it has many of the same characteristics, but it's much less energy dense, which means it's not a very good fit for EVs, where every kilogram matters when you're driving around. For stationary storage, that's not as big of a consideration, so the advantages that lithium iron phosphate has for cycle life, safety, cost, and depth of discharge possible start standing out. There was, because of those supply constraints, there's been a lot of movement towards lithium iron phosphate as an alternative to some of the what many may call the tier 1 suppliers in South Korea. That term is increasingly becoming less relevant. Over the next 5 years, due to developments in NMC chemistries, moving away from cobalt, manufacturing at better scale, NMC prices will continue to catch up with lithium iron phosphate chemistries. But there is an opportunity right now for these Chinese manufacturers to really get into the space. Obviously, with the coronavirus outbreak, we see we're actually analyzing that right now. There's a significant effects of the supply chain there. Obviously, with trade wars and tariffs, which have been reduced, there's a lot of dynamics here that are really causing this market to become volatile right now. A lot of uncertainty in terms of the supply chain, which I think does not represent a black swan risk, but maybe a gray swan risk. Looking at these commodities, looking at these battery chemistries. Keep your eye on it, because depending on how things play out, that we could be seeing some tight supply shortages, or maybe just slightly reduced supply compared to what we otherwise would have foreseen. One of the things that we can say for sure is that battery manufacturing capacity is going to increase dramatically, and it's going to diversify in its region as well. Battery manufacturing is seen as a key economic development, bringing manufacturing back to all of these various regions. I did take the numbers away from this graph. I'm sorry. If you do sign up for the service, I promise that the numbers of gigawatt hour capacity are included. But what we're seeing in 2019 is already a large scale up in terms of manufacturing. Important to note that this is not a forecast. This is not taking all of the information and extrapolating to battery manufacturing total for 2026. This is based only on known and announced under development factories that are in the market. So I would say that there's significant upside in this graphic for systems that have not been announced yet, have not even begun planning yet, that will be scaling up. We can see here that this is definitely going to increase. Obviously, electric vehicles are such a hot topic now, energy storage, in the energy industry just as much. There's concern about how does the supply chain look for actually meeting that demand, and as we can see, the supply chain for lithium-ion systems will be surging. Even more importantly, it will be diversifying. The China market represents the majority of the market for lithium-ion chemistry batteries right now. By 2026, it will be a little more than a third. So we are seeing significant shift into other markets. This could change if we see China really heavily reinvesting in lithium-ion batteries. Perhaps they'll maintain a 50% market share. What if the United States starts building out manufacturing capabilities? And what if we have to start considering alternative battery chemistries as part of the stationary storage equation? Where are those manufacturing bases going to be? How do the supply chains for those alternative commodities influence that? Keep your eye on the battery manufacturing. This is moving so quickly. This graphic doesn't even take into account the announcement from Total and Opal just a week ago. So much is happening even just in the first month of 2020 that it really is a remarkably fast-moving market. There's a lot of reasons why the market is moving so quickly, and so I wanted to spend the majority of my time here, maybe the next 15 minutes before stopping for questions, looking at sort of the market drivers and outlook and seeing where a lot of this movement is coming from. And I'll break this a little bit into the front of the meter and behind the meter side for drivers. Here we have a quick review of just some of the key market activities from Q3 2019. I bring this up when the slides are available. You can go through and take a look at this, and we have similar slides available publicly as part of our Energy Storage Monitor executive summary. Not so much so that you could read all this right now or so that I could read it off to you. I want to provide some context here because the energy storage market is diversifying in a way that I find incredibly exciting and slightly unprecedented. If you consider the way that so this is a clean energy webinar, clean energy organization that I'm thrilled to be participating with. Other clean techs are very much location specific. They're tied to the resource that's available. And even when a resource may be available, certain incentives or pushbacks have made it very difficult for those to be installed. If you look at a map of where solar was installed, you'll see a big gap in the southeast. The same for wind energy. Wind energy will be located in Texas and the breadbasket of wind in the Midwest, solar in the Southwest. There wasn't this sort of universal adoption. Whereas for energy storage, this truly is a fully nationwide, coast-to-coast opportunity. This is a U.S.-focused webinar, but of course I could apply this globally as well. We track several key markets, and in every one of those key markets, Australia, South Korea, China, Germany, the UK, and others, energy storage is being looked at very heavily, and we see massive deployments coming. This isn't a blue state question or a red state question. This is really an application that everybody is interested in. On the front of the meter side, that's being driven by utilities primarily. And a lot of this, you'll see some really fascinating policies from the Department of Energy Resources introducing SMART and implementing the new Clean Peak standard. New York has a lot of incentive programs that are operating as well as in California. On the utility side, though, that's one of the areas I'm really excited about, and I'll dive into this in a bit more detail. Utilities are sort of immune to any sort of, how do I want to phrase this? They don't really seem to be dipping their toes in the water, so to speak. We've seen a lot of these demonstration projects, and now we are seeing RFPs in pretty much every vertically integrated market. I mean, you can stroll across Dixie without missing a state where there's energy storage activity. The Duke and Carolinas has a $300 million program. You see here Georgia Power and Alabama Power are active. Tennessee Valley Authority, their recent integrated resource plan, has as much as gigawatts of energy storage. Entergy's installing storage. Oklahoma has a tri-grid system in a community where they're doing wind, solar, and storage. Texas, El Paso Electric, vertically integrated, is including storage. The deregulated markets have energy storage all over the place. This is truly a national trend, and there's really no area that's been immune to it. It's one of the benefits of energy storage is that it has so many applications: transmission, distribution, deferral, shifting solar power, providing ancillary services. Wherever you really install it, energy storage finds value. It's a bit like water into the cracks of a sidewalk. Wherever you seem to look, it seems to start making sense. That's a factor of cost declining, but also the recognition of that value. As utilities, as munis and co-ops, as people investing in wholesale markets start looking at the value energy storage provides, they see very quickly that it's outstripping the costs in many cases. And then as that value recognition continues, it'll be even more. On the behind the meter side, I would say that we are still a little more dependent on the incentive structures. And that's why these slides very much sort of complement each other. We have the Northeast, where you have a lot of incentive structures for behind-the-meter systems. California, of course, one of the leading markets for behind-the-meter systems with their self-generation incentive program. But this map will eventually become like the other one, with energy storage policies for behind-the-meter deployments all over the country. Behind-the-meter systems are being installed all over the country, but in the residential sense, it's very dependent on an emotional connection rather than a purely economical connection now. In the C&I sense, it really requires some sort of demand charge management opportunity as well. But really, once we start seeing aggregation, eligibility for systems to combine together into a larger product, once we start seeing more virtual power plants, more resiliency benefits after wildfires and further threats from climate change, that market is going to scale up dramatically as well. Looking now at our total pipeline, this is a measure of how many gigawatts of projects we have tracked in the market right now. A caveat being, of course, that not all of these projects are going to be built and constructed and come online. Many of them are more speculative or interconnection queue requests, filings, etc. But we can see that when we do add all those projects together, two trends immediately emerge. One, of course, is the scale. The energy storage market is scaling up rapidly. There's massive interest in it, and then that interest is becoming much more diverse geographically. We've gone from about 5 or 6 gigawatts in the pipeline 5 years ago to almost 80 gigawatts in the pipeline today. What's more, California doesn't even make up the majority of the market when it used to be 80 or 90% of the market for the total pipeline. We're seeing massive projects in interconnection queues in SPP and MISO in New York and ISO New England, PJM, Texas, California. We're seeing utilities in vertically integrated regions like Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, the Southeast, Pacific Northwest investing massive amounts in energy storage. There really is no region where this isn't a massive trend. And then sort of looking at the same graph a different way, looking at how the diversity has changed over time, you can see that that California portion, that 80% or so, starting to shrink, starting to get overcome by these the other direct markets that we track, like New York, New Jersey, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, et cetera, and even the all others category. These states where Idaho, other places like in the Dakotas, throughout the Midwest, places that we do track directly as part of our project database, but for our energy storage monitor coverage include as an all other sort of category. It is just an increasingly diverse market, which is super exciting to me. 2019 saw massive activity in that regard of projects being announced or examined, policies being looked at, integrated resource plans being looked at across various regions. And I wanted to highlight just one here because this is, I think, the perfect example of 2019, which is the PacifiCorp Integrated Resource Plan. 2019 saw massive amounts of recognition for energy storage, whether it's implementation of FERC Order 841, eligibility to participate in wholesale markets, implementation of first-of-their-kind policies like the Massachusetts Clean Peak Standard, whether it's the first year where we're really at scale for residential energy storage. There are tons of stories you can pick, and I picked this one because I think it's absolutely spectacular, and it shows you how fast this industry is moving, because it is moving so quickly that even utilities are beginning to catch up on it. Vertically integrated utilities, the hulking behemoth dinosaurs of the industry who have been pushing back against innovation, that's the perception that most people have when they talk about utilities. In reality, utilities are, of course, trying to do what they think is best for their ratepayers, what they think is best for their investors in the case of investor-owned utilities. A lot of the time, that means the status quo. That mindset is now evaporating rapidly in the face of the accelerated energy transition that we see here at Wood Mackenzie. And here's a very dramatic signpost of it. PacifiCorp releases their Integrated Resource Plan in 2017, which shows a gigawatt of solar coming online by 2036, starting in 2029. Not a very aggressive solar plan, obviously. 2 years later, what do we see? The total amount of solar has gone up by about a factor of 6. The installation timeline has been accelerated more than 9 years. The market is going to scale up to 3 gigawatts by 2024 compared to 1 gigawatt by 2036. These are dramatic changes from the previous integrated resource plan. What's changed? Prices have changed. The grid has changed. The technology surrounding these opportunities has changed as well. In particular, energy storage. This is another graph from PacifiCorp looking at their planned energy storage deployments. They want to get about 2.5 gigawatts of energy storage on their grid by 2038, and that is compared to 0 that they had in their integrated resource plan 2 years ago. Every single time we've seen an integrated resource plan and it's really considered storage, it's looked at it very heavily, in almost all cases, there's been some sort of investment in it because the value is starting to get recognized. As it is, we've gone from 0 to 60, almost quite literally here, looking at this acceleration. Instead of having no energy storage in the next 2 decades, we start getting up to half a gigawatt by 2024. Consider the market today, maybe nearly half a gigawatt just for 2019 in terms of the front of the meter space. This is a utility that's going to install that in just 1 year, in 2024, 5 years from now. That's how quickly this market is scaling up. It's really quite unprecedented. Obviously, the solar industry has scaled up dramatically, but the degree of uptake of recognition of energy storage is something that I think is relatively unique. We really haven't seen it. As a result, this is going to trickle through to all the fossil fuel organizations as well. We saw Hoosier Energy announcing that they were going to be retiring a coal plant and replacing it with wind, solar, storage, natural gas. This affected PacifiCorp's plans. Rather than build a new CCGT turbine, they're delaying that from 2030 to 2037, 7-year delay, a new CCGT in a utility territory. How fantastic is that? The peaking capacity has gone up, but mostly because they're converting a coal plant to natural gas. This is every buzzword that you can think of for the energy transition, and it's all happening in one utility's integrated resource plan, and it's all happened in just 2 years. That's what's so remarkable about this. It really is a hold on to your seat, buckle your seatbelt, hold on to your hats kind of situation here. Things are moving so quickly that just in January alone, you would be staggered by the massive amount of news that came out. I posted a tweet about this. I'm going to try to remember off the top of my head what the stories were. Just in 2020, any one of which would have made a year-defining story in, say, 2016. BlackRock diversifying their investment into clean tech with a massive focus on energy storage. Biggest infrastructure investment, unprecedented. Google Energy partnering with NV Energy to power a data center with time-matched solar plus storage as opposed to just buying RECs. Absolutely incredible. ESTEP moving towards resiliency. 63% of their budget, I think more than $500 million, moving towards reinforcing critical facilities with self-generation, with massive amounts of solar there as well, massive amounts of storage as well. Really just staggering news stories that are all just happening in 1 month. It's absolutely unbelievable. It really is a real pain because it's my job to sort of synthesize them all and tell you all about them. But for the market itself, it's just an absolutely thrilling time to be part of. Oh, we've got the PowerPoint giving me trouble here. Here we go. Just to drive home this integrated resource plan conversation, this is not limited to just PacifiCorp. If you look at all of the vertically integrated utilities who are looking at energy storage and have some of it in their resource plan, it's again nationwide. This is sort of excluding the deregulated markets where utilities may have targets such as New York, or have already implemented storage such as Massachusetts. Looking at these vertically integrated utilities, there's massive investment out in Puerto Rico as well, Hawaii, of course. So really, there isn't a vertically integrated utility that hasn't really dove into this pretty dramatically. And then, as I mentioned before, the pipeline fills in the gaps that you see in this map here. Massive speculation across the Midwest and the Northeast in these wholesale market applications or combination applications, working with a distribution utility to provide deferral applications while still participating in these markets, such as the Stirling Light project that was mentioned before, the Nantucket project from the earlier presentation, which also has the potential to participate in those markets. Just an absolutely massive shift of utility mindsets towards emerging technologies in a way that I hadn't seen since the utilities first decided to install poles and wires, really. This is going to add up to a really spectacular growth over the next 5 years. Questions about safety, obviously the regular hiccups you have scaling up an industry, confronting NIMBYism in some regions, regulatory hurdles, et cetera, have delayed the real scale up of the market a little bit from 2020 into 2021. But really all that's done is delay projects, delay the scale up. It hasn't really, it's not going to stop it. It's not going to suppress it. We're going to be going from about 430 megawatts by 2019, and we'll have those hard numbers for 2019 in March. Want to make sure we get them right. And we're going up by a factor of 12 by 2024, up to 5,400 megawatts, just in the United States. The vast majority of this will be front-of-the-meter systems driven by utilities, driven by merchant markets and eligibility in FERC Order 841. But don't discount that residential market, hovering around a gigawatt of energy storage. Absolutely incredible in the C&I market as well. This is going to translate into massive business opportunity. And if you're a clean energy proponent and you're trying to make this case to, say, a lawmaker, a state regulator, et cetera, you can point out that this is going to be a $5 billion market by 2024 based on the installed costs. It's going to be an absolutely incredible economic opportunity. There's going to be a lot of players in here trying to get their slice of this. People from the solar space moving in, software, everybody's going to be coming in trying to get a little piece of this. You're going to see a lot of institutional money come into the space as well. It's just going to be a real gold rush. And I'd remind everybody that the gold rush, you had $15 billion worth of gold, I believe it was, pulled out of the ground if you value it at today's value. But the value of the gold rush isn't in gold. All of this money, this $5 billion, is going to be installing the energy storage systems. For me, the true value of any gold rush is the guy who showed up in California and wanted to sell tents, and nobody wanted to buy his tents, but they said, we can't find a good pair of pants, and so he started cutting up his tents and making jeans. Now Levi Strauss, the company, makes about $5 billion each year. That's every 3 years, a California gold rush. So I look at this and I see the gold rush, I see the gold coming out of the ground, and I ask, who's going to be making the jeans? There's going to be so much value. How do you take these energy storage systems that are now on the grid and operate them for the next 20 years? How do you optimize them? How do you extract the most value from them? So I think that this is really just the starting point. This is the gold rush. What other businesses that we can't even foresee over the next 20 years is this gold rush going to create? Our forecast will be updated for 2025 in the next quarter and for March, and we're also excited to be able to update our forecast to be out for 10 years moving forward. That should be done either this quarter or the quarter after that. So very quickly, in the next 2 minutes or so, just a quick view of where I see things going in the future. 2019 has been a watershed year, seismic activity from utilities, residential markets, movement in the C&I space. Absolutely massive opportunity. But now there's going to be a transition. And that's sort of the energy transition practice that Wood Mackenzie has. For me, there's a combination of 3 words here that I think are absolutely critical. Adaptation, transition, and then transformation. Adaptation is this phase where if you're an infrastructure company or an investment firm right now, you may say, what's happening in the market with energy storage? We should figure out what's going on so that we can invest in infrastructure. Transition is the point where you have energy storage in the market and it's disrupting the markets, and you have coal, natural gas, nuclear, other people in a capacity market where prices have been affected. There's a transition towards more renewable energy. And then transformation is the step beyond that. What does an energy market look like in a state with a 100% renewable energy mandate? What does an energy market look like with systems that have effectively zero fuel costs? Does that market even still make any sense? Is that what we're going to be seeing? I don't think so. I think that we are, on some level, going to have to transform the way our electric system works. The first step of that is this adaptation question, is the eligibility question for energy storage. The second portion of that is in that transition where we start tapping into the opportunity that the eligibility has created. That's where we start seeing players competing with each other. And then from there, we start moving into the necessity phase. Rather than the Clean Energy States Alliance and the industry pushing up to regulators and saying, look at what energy storage can do, look at what we offer, look at the value we create, you will have regulators, policymakers, utilities, grid operators pulling energy storage up, saying in order to do what we want to do, energy storage is necessary. How are we going to achieve these goals? You're no longer trying to convince us. We need you to step up for us. That is what I see over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years for energy storage. An early rush to capture market value as a player, diversifying or establishing a niche market, building out the supply chain, figuring out what's going to happen with battery manufacturing for EVs, for stationary storage. Then from there, that opportunity question. How do we commercialize those investments? How do we scale the solutions? How do we compete and outcompete not only the energy storage market, but how does the energy storage market compete with the rest of the power industry? And then from there, true transformation, decentralization, deep decarbonization, disruption at the grid edge. This is the area that's a lot harder to predict. If I could predict the energy transformation perfectly, I'd probably be out collecting investors right now instead of being on a webinar with you. But I think we all have some sort of vision of how this transformation is going to look. And I think the energy storage is going to be such a huge part of that. It may not look like it looks today. It may be gravity-based. It may be a new innovative chemistry, flow battery, new lithium-ion solution that's cheaper and more effective. It could look like none of those things. It could look like all of those things. There's so much opportunity, but it's hard to nail down. But I think the one thing that I think that most people would agree on is that there is going to be this opportunity. You can follow the money. You can see the tea leaves right now are pointing towards change. There's forces, institutions that are sort of pulling back that change. But as we saw, 2019 is when the floodgates really started to open, where we started seeing not so much the floodgates of true deployments, but recognition. Actually, the ability and capacity to correctly value energy storage as an asset to the grid. That's only going to continue, and it's going to drive things forward dramatically. So with that, Todd, I think I will hand things back to you for some Q&A, and I'm happy to go back and pop back to any relevant slides as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. That was an enormous amount of information and very, very clearly conveyed. I appreciate it. So we do have a large number of questions. I just want to mention one thing before we start going to questions. You mentioned on one of your slides that the aggregation of behind the meter storage is a model that you're kind of looking forward to, and I just wanted to say that's happening here in the Northeast, and especially it was pretty much pioneered right here in Vermont by Green Mountain Power, and
Absolutely.
They now have, I think, about 2,000 residential batteries that they aggregate to reduce their costs for capacity and transmission services. And we're seeing that model spread, especially with the recent addition of storage into the state energy efficiency plan in Massachusetts, and now Rhode Island's done the same thing. And we're seeing that model spreading with proposals in Connecticut and New Hampshire. There's just a lot of interest right now in this area in that particular model. And we're seeing third-party aggregators getting brought in as well. So I think that has already begun, and it seems to be gathering momentum. Okay, I wanted to get to as many of these questions as we can from listeners. One is, what are the various revenue streams for storage, front of the meter storage, for longer duration, since the market is moving away from ancillary services, which are typically short duration types of applications?
Yeah, great question. For me, there are a couple of things that we talked about a lot in 2016 that I'm starting to think maybe slightly irrelevant or less relevant than we really thought they needed to be. One of them is energy storage mandates. We're living in a post-mandate world right now, as we see from the utilities investing in this. We saw the California mandate, New York, Massachusetts, small one in Oregon, then New Jersey. I think that now we're in a situation where these direct incentives that we've seen from DOER, NYSERDA, California, are more of the part that's going to drive growth. And then a similar portion to that is a movement away from this conversation of multiple value streams, battery systems that do everything. Here are all the realms they work in. Here are the 13 use cases that they have. At the end of the day, the battery is either charging, discharging, or not doing anything. Every value stream that it has is effectively some combination of those activities timed to a certain signal. And to me, I'm seeing a lot of movement based just on very simple use cases for storage. The first ones were just ancillary services. Follow this regulation signal. You don't have to do anything else. Now, for the longer duration systems, the use cases are very effectively capacity. They're either capacity through standalone storage, like we're seeing in Pacific Gas and Electric's territory, or New York, for instance, with the Ravenswood project, or their solar plus storage capacity, shifting solar energy, or simply making the storage cheaper using the investment tax credit to provide capacity, shift renewable energy, or provide a longer or firmer supply of renewable energy. And for those applications, do you really want to have an energy storage system that's doing that, that's also doing ancillary services? I'm not really sure. Why not have a separate system that does that as well, that's designed and optimized for that? There absolutely is the opportunity to add on some layers of ancillary services when you're not doing other things, but I think that that's more of an upside and not a necessary portion to drive energy storage in the future. One other note that I wanted to make is that a lot of value that energy storage provides, it does while it's already doing something else. So for instance, that system on Nantucket is going to be deferring massive amounts of investment in underwater cables, for instance, or some sort of on-site generation. At the same time, it could be providing capacity services or discharging for the New England ISO New England capacity market, providing energy arbitrage. It can do that while saving energy for peak demand periods. All those things sort of come together. You don't have to really think about it as multiple things. It's just value that stacks on itself automatically. I would say that capacity is going to be the biggest opportunity moving forward. Flexibility in the front of the meter space will be the watchword as these utilities install more renewables and need more ability to shift those renewables to times of peak demand. Then, once we start seeing these 100% renewable goals, it becomes a much more complicated question. Longer duration storage, potentially much more expensive because it's such long duration, and then that's an opportunity to expand the way we think about energy storage's value and revenue as well.
Okay, great. You mentioned that much of the industry has essentially piggybacked on the EV or electric vehicle momentum in terms of battery, production,
Right.
lithium-ion ramping up, and factories being built and so forth. So somebody is asking, how much do you see used repurposed EV batteries having a role in stationary storage deployment? And I guess this is looking forward.
Yep, it's going to be a huge factor, or maybe not huge. It's going to be a significant factor. Let me moderate myself a little bit here for the first time in my life. Effectively, what the question is you take these EV batteries, which are really have very significant performance requirements, et cetera. When they no longer meet those requirements, you can repurpose them for stationary storage. Effectively take them out, slap them in a container. Now you're providing grid services. You don't have to worry if the battery is 20% degraded because you don't have space constraints or as significant safety constraints potentially as you would have in an EV. The problem with this is that there's going to be a lag period. The EV industry is still very new. I mean, you can't even get an EV in many of the states, in many of our markets here. They're really not offered. What we're going to need is a double scaling. We're going to need to scale up the EV market, and then we're going to have to wait for those electric vehicles to get older and those batteries to come off the EVs. for an EV to get retired and then the battery to be repurposed. So that's not only, so imagine if an EV retires 10 years from now, and the impression I get is that EVs last pretty darn long based on the degradation rates that we're seeing. Of course, that could be, that's mostly speculation. But if it takes 10 years, say, for an EV to come off the market, that means that the EVs that we have on the road now, which are very few, will start coming off the market in about 10 years. So we have to wait a long time before we start seeing a large number of EVs coming off the market to give us that ability to repurpose them. So if you've got your eye on the horizon, repurposing, recycling batteries is going to be a very big market opportunity, but it's not going to be as immediate as the market for new build, fresh off the assembly battery systems for the immediate deployments that we're seeing in the next 5 or 10 years.
Great, thank you. Could you please go put up the slide that shows the predicted trend of pricing? Somebody just has requested that be put back up on the screen. And while we're doing that, there are a number of questions regarding the connection between storage and greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So one person says, from a GHG reduction perspective, is storage plus renewables advancing as fast as storage alone? Another person says, is it accurate to call storage clean without accounting for the source of the energy being stored? And there's some other similar questions about, the sort of how we make sure that storage is, in addition to all the other things it's doing, serving a clean energy policy goal. So what can you say about that?
What a fantastic question. Absolutely. And what a fascinating question. The intersection of supply chains, technology, and policy, and then the market as we have it today. If you put an energy storage system on a grid that's 100% coal, and you store electricity and then discharge it for no reason, energy storage systems, you lose electricity every time you run it. There are net loss of electricity due to round trip efficiency. So if you do that, you're creating the need for more coal. So what's the break-even point? And that's where a lot of people have started to model. If it's 50% solar, does that count? If it's 50% wind and 25% solar, is that green? It depends on what your supply chain is. It depends what your commodities are. How much carbon went into building the battery in the first place? What is its carbon footprint going to be during the recycling process? These are a lot of really unanswered questions. And I'll bring up a couple of points to sort of, so a long way of saying I'm not going to answer that question because it is so incredibly complicated. And it varies dramatically depending on what market you're in and where the battery came from, et cetera. I worked with the Wood Mackenzie battery raw materials team looking at just this question. We put out a blog post on it a couple months back, just on a single commodity, graphite. And graphite is a huge component of EVs, and of course a big component of lithium-ion batteries and stationary storage. And the main supply chain for graphite comes from refining fossil fuels. Isn't that fascinating? You're refining gas to put in an internal combustion engine, and then you're using a byproduct of it to create electric vehicles that don't require gas anymore. If you could transition tomorrow the entire fleet to electric vehicles, you would then remove the supply chain for the graphite to make those electric vehicles because you wouldn't be refining oil anymore into gas. That's what's really a fascinating opportunity to innovate in this market. Are there technologies that have potentially quote unquote cleaner supply chains than lithium ion? At what point is a lithium ion battery clean? That's a really great question. If the alternative to building a lithium ion battery is, say, running an oil plant in ISO New England or a coal plant in the Northwest or a natural gas plant in the Southeast, what's the tipping point? The DOER is looking at this with the Clean Peak standard. If you have a standalone energy storage system, what makes it clean? Well, what time you charge effectively makes it clean by the analysis that they were looking at in their last update. Charging it during times of peak solar demand, charging it during times of peak wind demand, and then discharging at the peak, solar and wind supply. But that is very much an open question. What is the green value of energy storage? If you want to make the grid run on renewables, then you're going to need energy storage. The clean question becomes a little bit more tricky, a little more complicated. Are you going to see the oil majors pushing towards carbon capture and sequestration? They will say that is a clean option, and they're entirely valid. That's an entirely valid point of view. What is the technology that's going to come out of that? Is energy storage? What are the what's the carbon footprint of this? How can we make it clean? I think that once you get to higher penetration of renewables, if that's your goal, and your alternative is running poor performing natural gas plants, then I think it's a pretty no-brainer option that it's not only more cost effective, but that it's also cheaper. But where that line is really depends market to market. Sorry, a bit of a rambling question there, but that's a topic that I think about all the time.
Quite all right. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of the hour, but that was fascinating. And thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you to Dan Finn-Foley and Emery Juk for their presentations. The entirety of the webinar will be posted in our webinar archive, both as a set of slides and also as a recording. So if you missed it or missed part of it, or you'd like to review it or send a link to somebody who would like to see it, it will be in our archive shortly, probably within a day or two. And along with all the other webinars we've produced over the past few years. And now I will turn it back over to Samantha to close us out. And I think we have an upcoming webinar to announce as well. Samantha?
Thanks, Todd, and thank you everybody for attending our webinar. So I do want to let you know before you go that we have a webinar coming up on February 12th. The topic of that webinar is a very interesting project in Utah, Soleil Lofts. It is the largest solar plus storage virtual power plant in the country. It's a very interesting project. You can register for this webinar on our website, cesa.org/webinars. And as Todd said, this is also where you can find materials from today's webinar. Thank you again, everybody, for attending. We hope to see you at the next one. Bye.